If you have your Bible with you, we're reading from 1 Kings in chapter 19. 1 Kings in chapter 19. And we'll read from verse 1, 1 Kings 19 and verse 1. They're practically the same verses that we read last Lord's Day morning. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and withal how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose and went for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. And as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, then an angel touched him, and said unto him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was a cake baking on the coals, and a cruse of water at his head, and he did eat and drink, and let him down again. And the angel of the Lord came again the second time, and touched him, and said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. And he arose and did eat and drink, and went in the strength of that meat 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the mount of God. And he came thither unto a cave, and lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said unto him, What doest thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. May God bless his word to our hearts this morning. For those of you that were with us last Lord's Day morning, we were dwelling on this passage about Elijah and Elijah in the depths of depression. We know that for quite a number of months now we've been noticing something about Elijah the Tishbite, and the man that was greatly used of God to go into Ahab and Queen Jezebel to say that there was going to be no more rain for quite a considerable length of time. And we've looked at Elijah, we've looked at him at the brook, we've looked at him at the widow's home, we've looked at him recently whenever he's standing on the Mount Carmel, and then last Lord's Day morning we were looking at him in the depths of despair. If there's one thing that I am very conscious of today whenever I preach here from this pulpit, and that is that there's very few families at times that are not at some time or another ushered into the depths of depression and despair. And sometimes I find, and rightly or wrongly, that sometimes whenever someone appears to be always in cloud nine, they seem to descend into those depths. And depression is something that, as we said last week, that Spurgeon suffered with, Abraham Lincoln did, and many other people. And some people live in a state of denial and saying, well, it could never ever happen to me. In 1 Kings chapter 18 we have looked at Elijah, and he's in the heights of success. But in chapter 19 he's in the depths of despair. Jezebel has sent a messenger to Elijah to say to Elijah, by tomorrow you're going to be dead. And Elijah's afraid. And as we covered last week, that if Elijah was to have gone to have seen a psychiatrist, he would have been diagnosed as suicidal, because he's gone off his food, he's away on his own, and he wants to be alone, as people usually do whenever they're in those periods or bouts of depression. And I suppose it's true to say that modern day psychology would call this here the withdrawing symptoms. He wants to be alone. I said last Lord's Day morning that I would pick up the threads here and what is probably quite a familiar story to many as to how this man here is lifted from the depths of despair and he's transformed and he's touched, and he sees that there's still work to be accomplished. Whenever I was visiting in Holywell this week, I seem to have down through the years quite a bit. And you see young men and you see young women in the depths of despair and depression. And I remember passing the remark here one day in church that many years ago, whenever I was walking into Tobernaveen, there was a young man sitting outside having a smoke. He had several body piercings, he had rings everywhere. But as I walked into Tobernaveen, he said to me, "Hello, Mr. Patterson." And I stopped. And I said to him, "How would you know me?" He said, "I sang in your church." I sang in your church. I remember him singing. It was a family group, a family that were singing. And so I asked him the question, where did it all go wrong? Where did it all go wrong? As far as I know, he was a bright young lad and all the rest of it. And he was very honest with me. And he answered in one word: drugs. And so you find that there's people that are being treated, some with maybe bipolar disease or illness, some with maybe other ailments like addictions and all the rest of it. But I'll say this here, dear friend, in Elijah's case, it wasn't drugs that brought him here, nor was it some other addiction as such as we hear about in modern society. But what brought him here? I said last Lord's Day morning, there was a number of things that brought him here. And the same things could bring any of us here. And I tried to summarize it up, and I said this here. First of all, he saw the wrong things. He saw the wrong things. And I'm too aware this morning that the internet has brought a complete new challenge in the Lord's work. And there are many today that are meeting people on the internet, and I have met them. I've met them. I have some that have sat in our house, and the people would not know this, or I would never ever divulge it, of course, but in the hour of temptation, they found themselves in a snare. But what brought Elijah to this place? He had no internet, he had no television, he had no radio. He started to get his eyes on things instead of on God. Let me say to you this morning that if you're a professing Christian, as I am today, it's very important to keep focused on God and not on things. Because things are only things, and one day they will rust or corrupt or whatever. And so he looks at the wrong things. Then secondly, last week I said he sought the wrong things. We're told he went for his life, and yet he requests for himself that he might die. His primary concern here was his own will and way. It wasn't all plain sailing for Elijah. Elijah finds him here at this particular moment, and he's looking his own will and his own way. And then I said last Lord's Day, he said the wrong things. He said, "I'm no better than my fathers." Who told him that? And sometimes it shocks us maybe, whenever we hear of great men and women of God who have gone through bouts or periods of depression. As I read about Elijah here, and I'm no psychiatrist nor do I profess to be, there are those of you in the congregation with a far greater knowledge of these things than I will ever have. But as I read this passage, I discover that his depression was not caused by one factor alone. Now you hear people talk today maybe about postnatal depression, and so they can link it to childbirth. But in Elijah's case, I don't believe it was one factor alone. There's a number of factors that were involved, and the first one was fear. We're told in verse 3, when he saw that, he arose and went for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and he leaves his servant there. He's frightened because of the threats of Jezebel. Fear is usually a factor in depression. I wonder this morning, because I want to be in the real world today. Maybe there's someone in our congregation today, and you're bound by fear. You're bound by fear. God has not given to us the spirit of fear, but of love and of power and of a sound mind. Maybe afraid of failure. Maybe afraid of loneliness. Maybe afraid of not living up to the expectations that people have put on you. Maybe you say to yourself today, I haven't been the son, I haven't been the daughter that I should have been. I haven't been the husband or the wife that I could have been. And so fear seeks to paralyze. I think another factor was that I've touched on, and that is a failure, because in verse 4 he says to God, he says, it is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, I'm not better than my fathers. He held a very negative opinion of himself. Now, the Bible tells us not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. But I tell you this, dear friend, and there are those of you with wee children in that, don't always be down on them. Praise them whenever they do well. Don't always be negative. Now, there's times to be negative and all the rest of it, but praise them. It'll go a long way in life. You see, sadly, there are those that come through life and they feel, oh, I'm no good at anything. My mother and my father always said, I heard a man the other night talk, a Roman Catholic man. And he said, my father always scolded me. No matter what I did, my father always had a lesson for me. I couldn't drive the tractor right. I couldn't do things right. Yes, there's the time for the scolding, but there's the time for the uplifting. I believe the third factor was that of fatigue. He's exhausted. Verse 5 tells us, and as he lay and slept under a juniper tree. He's emotionally drained, he's physically exhausted, and he needs rest. And I think the fourth factor is that of futility, because in verse 10 he reckons that he's the only one that is left. And they're seeking to take my life away also. And while he sits there, Elijah talks through his frustrations, and then we're told that an angel comes and touches him, and then he finishes in a cave, and God comes to him, and God says to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? I've often thought of those verses, that phrase, and we can take it out of context this morning perhaps, that what doest thou here, Elijah? And I've tried to tease it out at different times over the years. What is God saying to us? Is there someone here this morning, and maybe you're saved 10, 20, 30, maybe longer years ago, but you've never gone anywhere spiritually. You've gone round and round in circles, but never got anywhere. And maybe God would say to you, what are you doing here? It's my plan that you might live a consistent Christian life. As Paul said to the church at Corinth, to be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of God. You know, whenever somebody's maybe in something in one moment and they're out of it another moment and they're in it another moment, and so unstable. What are you doing, Elijah is saying? Maybe there's someone here in our meeting and God is saying to you, why are you trying to serve two masters? It's time to make up your mind. You're either going to serve me or serve the gods of Baal. You know, as I read this, I can't help but notice God knew why he was there. God knew, because God was all-knowing. But God listened to Elijah as Elijah poured out his heart to him. He listened to his feelings of anger, his feelings of bitterness, his feelings of self-pity. It's good not to bottle those things up, but to talk them out and to talk them through. We all can have such feelings at times, and unless we rid ourselves of them, they will poison us emotionally. Those things which we're reminded of in the book of Galatians, those things like fear and anger and malice and hatred and jealousy and self-pity and so on, they're all very slow killers. And so unfortunately Elijah has arrived at the wrong conclusion. So at this point the Lord chose to reveal to him just how wrapped up and distorted his view of things had become. I would say Elijah had a very distorted view of himself. Maybe you could have that today. I think Elijah had a very distorted view of God at this particular phase in his life. And so God says to him, "Tell me, Elijah, what's wrong?" If you go on, I'm sure it's probably on the internet. I'm sure it is. I don't know whether I probably read this somewhere and I jotted it down. If you want to get depressed, there's 10 things to do. And I'll just mention these in passing today, and you can check them out. I'm sure they're probably on the web. Maybe there's 100 things on the web as to how to get depressed. But I'm just going to mention 10. The first one I said this here was nurse resentments. Always assume the worst in people. When you feel ignored, misunderstood or mistreated, enter a circle of hating yourself and hating others. Number 2 was live in the past. Make sure that you colour the past with a very rosy glow, that everything from the past looks so nice, but everything in the future cover with a black cloud. It will look so painful. The third one was, and I suppose this was applicable to Elijah, was ignore your body. Don't listen to your body. If you feel tired, don't rest. When you feel run down, don't listen. When you need to relieve stress by exercise, have a Red Bull instead. That was the advice. Isn't that what a lot of people's feasting on and so on at present to try to get a boost? Number 4 was ignore your soul. Pretend you are a machine. Don't think too hard about the junk you're feeding your soul. Number 5 was believe the lie that everyone has got it together except you. Do you ever feel that? That everybody, you look maybe at some parent or some husband or some wife and you say to yourself, oh, they've got it all together, but I don't have. It's not always the wisest place to go. Number 6 was become a cynic. People don't change. Number 7 was never cry. Don't ever show weakness. Remember, there's therapy and tears. You'll read about that in the scriptures. Number 8 was never apologize. Always justify your reasons. Let your self-defense keep you puffed up and protected. Number 9 was maintain an impossible standard for yourself. Set yourself up for failure. You set yourself up to be the perfect father, the perfect mother, the perfect husband, the perfect wife. Well, you're probably setting yourself up for failure. And then I thought about number 10, because number 10 said, it's unique to you and it's unique to me. And I suppose it's unique to this generation too. I just said this here. Perhaps it's about being with an unhealthy friendship that brings you down. Maybe it's about stalking someone on Facebook that you need to unfriend. Maybe it's a phone number that you need to delete from your phone. And so those were 10 steps. If we want to get depressed. The fact is, dear friend, today is that many of God's young people battle depression. I suppose most of us at some time or another we will go through situational depression. Maybe your child moves away. Maybe they head off maybe to university across the water or even to Belfast or wherever. As a result, you feel very down about it. Situational depression, sometimes there can be the external factors, there can be the weather. Now as we come into November, people will talk about going on a low in November. Maybe it's to do with the job, you lose your employment. It can cause depression, situational depression. Maybe it's to do with a family or a trial or a relationship breakup or some struggle in a relationship. Maybe it's sickness. There's times in life whenever depression is a normal response to a difficult situation, you think of that as being a care. Of being a care. Some of you have heard me say, and I can say it publicly today, Stephen obviously has had to leave church this morning earlier. I value Stephen in this congregation as much as I value any of you. Stephen was dedicated to God all those years ago by Winston and myself there in the Killymoon Road. Stephen's a very precious lad to God. Don't let anyone ever hear me criticising. Put yourself in that situation. See how well we would do. Maybe there are those today, and there are. And I think of those of the congregation that are in that situation this morning, that used to always be out at church, but today they're at care. They can't. They must have one of the most difficult jobs to do. They must have. I'm almost through today, and I covered maybe a little bit of this last week, so you can forgive me if there's an overlap. The causes of depression. So I see our surgery in Dungannon's under threat, so maybe we'll have no doctor now in a few months' time anyway. But there's many causes as to why people are depressed. One of them is the death of a loved one or a friend. I've touched on the next one. Whenever a family member moves away, whenever there's isolation, and I tell you as a pastor, I've had to cope with this. Well, there's been young girls with abortion who have murdered their little children. And yes, they can smile and they can dance and they can go on with life as if everything is normal. They can float in and out of relationships. They can stand as if everything is okay. But I'm afraid in the ministry, you get them at the other end. The end of suicide. And all the rest of it. There's that of rejection, where there's this low self-esteem. There's that of a disappointment in life. There's that of failure in some area of life. There's the genetic vulnerability. There's the chemical imbalance. There's the changes in the hormones. There's substance and there's sexual abuse. There's all those different factors. And I'm sure many others that can result in depression. Depression is a hopelessness that is not consistent with reality. Do you know, dear friends, this morning, did you ever stop and think that Moses was depressed? Moses, the leader of Israel, taking the Egyptians out of the land of Israel. You know what Moses said? He said in Numbers 11, verse 15, he said this here, he said to God, "If thou deal this with me, kill me, I pray thee." You ever stop and think of Job? We talk about the patience of Job. We talk about all these lovely things about Job. But you know, not all of them are. You know what Job said this here, and I know that Job had a good beginning and he had a good ending, but in between there was a lot of nasty things. In between, whenever he lost everything, he wished he had never been born. He becomes suicidal. He's extremely depressed. And you read chapter 3, he said, "Let the day perish in which I was born. I only wish that my mother's womb had been my grave." He is so depressed. Think of Jonah. He wanted God to kill him. He's spiritually depressed. He wasn't happy that God had spared him. But here's Elijah. And Elijah finds a place for him by himself. He focuses on the negative. He forgets about God's provision in the past, and he says, "I've had enough." But I see time has beat me this morning, and I want you to notice, dear friend, that as he slept under a juniper tree, an angel touches him, and the angel says to him, "Arise and eat." And what Elijah needed was a good night's sleep. And he needed some food. And they were told on the strength of this, he goes for 40 days. 40 days to the Mount of Horeb. He receives God's provision. What happens to him? He gets involved with people again. He focuses on others instead of himself. There are many people down through the years, and I've said to them, if they're depressed and it's not spiritual, if it's spiritual, you'll need spiritual help. If it's not spiritual, I would encourage you to go to the doctor. God has given to them brains. He's given to them a lot. Seek medical help. If it's spiritual, seek spiritual help. What Elijah needed here, he needed food, he needs sleep, because the journey is too great for him. I'll conclude this morning with a story about a man called Frederick Nolan. And Frederick Nolan was serving God in North Africa at a time of terrible persecution. Whenever Christians were being martyred, many were running for their lives, and Nolan was one of the ones that ran, and he ran for quite a distance on foot. He was absolutely exhausted, and he checks to the right of him, and he finds that there's a cave, a small cave, and he went into that cave, and he said to himself, "I'm going to wait here, the captors will come and I'll be killed, but that's it." And he said as he sat in that cave, he watched a small spider weaving a web across the mouth of that cave, eventually covering the entire mouth of the cave. He felt fascinated, and then his persecutors arrived, and they looked at the cave, and they saw the spider's web, and they said there'd be nobody in there. He couldn't be in there. And so they left, and Nolan escaped. Later he said this here, with God, a spider's web is like a wall. Without God, a wall is like a spider's web. God has still a work to do for Elijah. God has still a work to do in each of our lives, until that day whenever he comes, or he calls us home. And God's going to bring someone into Elijah's life that's going to help him again, to get him focused back on God.